Hello, everybody. Welcome to this night's event. It's so sunny outside today, though. It's so beautiful. I'm happy that this is the night that Olivia and I are here because it still feels like the daytime. Um, so we'll just briefly introduce ourselves before we kind of get into some meat of this presentation. Says me, I'm a vegan, but that's okay. Um, my name is Carly. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the social worker at the Trans Health Clinic at Kingston Community Health Centre. And I didn't prep anything in terms of like a fun fact or anything, but so I won't put Olivia on the spot to do that either. Unless there's something that you think, Olivia, you really want to share. I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, so my name is Olivia Sweeney. My maiden name was Hunter. I don't know if that's coming up on this iPhone thing, but I'm a nurse practitioner. I use she, her pronouns. I'm at the Transgender Health Clinic at Kingston Community Health Centre. And I help with medical transition and surgical transitions, and also some outreach with Carly for the community. And I'm really excited to be here today.
Yay. We're happy to have you here, Olivia. So I am going to share my screen to get into our presentation today. For most of the first half, I'm going to be talking a lot. So you'll have to bear with this. And then Olivia is going to come back and join us a bit later. So here we go with the Zoom technology. Sharing. Okay. One moment. How is this looking? Maybe Dan or Olivia, can you give me a yes? I see it done.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So today we are all here to chat about medical and legal transition, which I assume is on the top of folks' minds who might be attending this presentation. If you may be already a client of our clinic, if you may be on the wait list, or if you may be considering attending our clinic. We're going to do our best to make this pretty comprehensive, but also very general at the same time. So this will be a fun mixture. So as Stan mentioned, this session is recorded. We want to maintain everyone's confidentiality. So this is not an appropriate space to share personal health history or your legal identifiers. So we'll just ask folks to be conscious of that when they're asking questions. If you do come on mic, or just for when you're sharing, if you're asking questions, please avoid really using your personal stories and your personal health history. Try and make it a little bit general. That will maintain confidentiality. So I'm going to start us off to speak about the legal transition today. But in general, we're going to begin talking a little bit about general disclaimers and KCHC. Then I will jump into legal transition information about name change and gender marker change. We'll have time for questions. And then Olivia is going to help us out to talk about puberty suppression, hormone replacement therapy, and surgeries. And we will also have time for questions after that. So kind of broken down into these two sections with dedicated time for questions. So thanks, San, for monitoring the chat for the questions, or you could hold your questions until that exact time. That would be really great. So I have two screens here. So if I'm kind of like turning around, it's because that's what's going on. I also could say I'm in my clinic office today. So you can see it's very clear around me. I can even show you a little bit more what my office looks like. Plants and posters. So it's a nice space here. I'm excited to see some of you and meet some of you. I'm joining you from the clinic, which our clinic is on Weller Ave. So I'm going to start this part of the presentation with a quote from Alok, who is a trans author, poet, and artist. Gender is not what people look like to other people. It is what we know ourselves to be. No one else should be able to tell you who you are. That's for you to decide. So some individuals will choose to take steps to medically or legally transition, and some will not. There's no linear or necessary path for trans folks when it comes to making medical and legal decisions, because everybody has unique goals and needs. A lot of what we're talking about today also may involve the idea of a binary. We recognize that trans people may not identify with this binary, although some might. This session is intended to demystify a bit and provide a brief summary of possibilities within the Ontario context. So we won't be able to go into details today. I will go into a little bit with the legal stuff, but especially the medical presentation will be quite a broad overview. So if you do come to Kingston Community Health Centre for gender affirming care, we'd be happy to speak with you individually about your own unique needs and your own unique situation. But just a note that today it might be a bit broad. Another note just about terminology. So we might often use the word trans or transgender, and this is used as an umbrella term for trans and gender nonconforming identities, and recognizing that there are a lot of different gender identities within this umbrella, including non-binary, gender fluid identities, and folks who might still be questioning or exploring their gender identity. So a little bit just first off about Kingston Community Health Centre. And the other thing that I always am like shouting from the rooftops when we're talking about medical transition is that gender affirming care is within the scope of primary care providers. If you have a family doctor or a nurse practitioner, our clinic does operate to kind of to solve to fit a gap, fill the gap. But we're not the only individuals who can do this work. So our clinic provides care for the southeast region of Ontario. It's a very large geographical area. Some folks might travel up to 2 hours to get here. And our clinic right now has a wait time of 8 to 12 months. And that's due to the number of referrals that we receive, huge number of referrals, and the large catchment area that we serve. So the program scope, it is limited to gender affirming needs. So we don't manage patients' ongoing primary care needs. And we also don't follow folks long-term. So once they are stable with their medical treatment, individuals get discharged back to their primary care provider. At our clinic, we offer gender affirming counseling with a social worker such as myself, where we might explore identity and community resources or social transition. And then we also offer our medical team who provides hormone therapy and surgical planning visits. At our clinic, before being prescribed any medication, the first meetings would be with the social worker or the nurse practitioner, where we'll be discussing gender journey and goals. We recognize there's a real diversity in this journey. Everybody has unique timelines and unique goals. It's just important to note that prescriptions aren't given right away because we have a process to go through together before this step, which includes collecting a health history. So at our clinic, we do recognize that you are the expert on your identities. We also recognize that healthcare settings are not always kind to trans folks due to transphobia and cisnormativity. And we will strive to provide you with affirming and respectful and inclusive care with this in mind. Okay, here we go. So this section is going to be a bit meaty. It's going to be a bit technical because we'll be talking about how to change gender, your name and gender marker in Ontario. This will be specifically for folks who are 18 and over, who have been living in Ontario for the last 2 years and who have a birth certificate from Ontario. That's the most straightforward process, which will be surprising because of how complicated they make it. If you're not one of those categories, if you're younger than 18 or if you're not born in Ontario, it's possible to still complete these steps, but that's not what I'm going to be focusing on today, because I'm going to try and get through some of the basic basic information for that general population. So the process can feel quite overwhelming because of these government forms. So it's key to go really step by step and break it down into pieces. So you can remember, like for a name change, and in general, a name change is not trans specific. So it's something I like to mention. There might be sections that ask interesting details, for example, about like parental information. It's not because you need parents' permission to change your name. It's because they are trying to determine your identity, trying to make sure that you're not committing identity theft or fraud. So there are a few folks who are involved in this process, one of whom is a guarantor and one is a commissioner, which we'll talk about later. They're involved just to prove that you are who you say you are, nothing about your gender, nothing about having to prove you're trans to these people. Their goal is to prevent frauding the government for identity. So that's something to keep in mind, because it can sometimes be a bit confusing and a bit overwhelming. So the main way to change your name and gender marker is with the birth certificate. And all of the forms are available on the Ontario website, which is a central forms repository. It's best to download all the forms from there because sometimes they get updated. We're going to provide you a link to some of those as well. So we're going to start with changing your name. There will be time for questions, like I mentioned. And just know that this part is the legal part. The medical stuff is going to be in the second half of the presentation. So if you're really not interested in this at all, that's okay too. But we'll try and I'm going to try and break this down as easily as possible. So for changing your legal name, there are, in general, different areas and places that you'll have to update your legal name. The main first step one, is what we're going to be talking about today. After you have your legal name changed, then you can update it in many different places. But this kind of step one is the most complicated part. So there's generally a few parts of this process to change your name. The main is the application to change your name. And in the application, it does involve some guarantor information and to be signed by a commissioner. And there's also something called a request for non-publication, which we'll talk about, which is optional. And the fee for changing your legal name is $137. So this is what the form looks like on the right. It's called Application to Change an Adult's Name. And there are 7 parts to this application. You should know that you might not have to complete all 7 parts. So even though it seems really, really thick and large and scary, some of the sections might not be applicable to you. So if you are married, for example, there's a page where you have to give notice to your spouse of the name change, not to see if they agree or disagree, but just to notify them. If you're not married, you don't have to complete that section. If you've been pressed with a criminal charge, law enforcement orders, convicted of a criminal offense, there's a page for that. If you've been ordered by court to pay a fine, there's a page for that. If you're 17 or under, there's some information required about individuals with legal custody of you. So if you're over 18, that part doesn't have to be completed. So in those things that I suggest that I was just mentioning, even though it seems like a really, really long application, some of it might not be applicable to you. Like I said, that there's a fee, which can be paid by credit card or by check or by money order. Most people use credit card to just fill out the information in the package here. The other thing to kind of note about this application is there might be information requested about parent names. I think I mentioned, it's not about getting somebody's permission, it's to prevent fraud, essentially. Okay, so as you fill out this application, and then it says that you need a guarantor. And the purpose of the guarantor is an individual who can prove you are who you say you are. So this is somebody who has known you for 12 months for the name change. So there's a list that they give you of individuals who can be accepted as your guarantor. They include, they're listed here. A lot of people use their family doctor, if possible, as their guarantor, because sometimes the doctor is involved in other steps of this transition that I'll discuss. But if you don't have a family doctor, if you've known your pharmacist for a year, they could be a good option. Your dentist, if you have a family member who is a lawyer or a nurse, a banker, there's a number of all these different people who can act as your guarantor. For this name change application, if you don't have somebody who meets the criteria on this list, then you can find someone other than a relative, not a relative, who has known you for at least 5 years. So for the name change, they give you kind of a bit of leeway. So the guarantor has a section that they have to fill out and sign. So this is just showing you what that looks like. Basically, they're saying how long they've known you. And also they're trying to prove that you live in Ontario, you are who you say you are. The other person who's involved is a commissioner of oaths. So a commissioner is somebody who takes an oath when you sign an affidavit or a statutory declaration. So that is a confusing way to say that they will ask you to swear or affirm that what is in your document is true. So these individuals could be lawyers or judges or clerks at the City Hall. They could also be the MPP in Kingston. Their name is Ted Shue. But also some people don't know that Service Ontario workers can act as commissioners of oath. So they're pretty much the easiest one to get so that they can sign this document with you. So when you meet with the commissioner, you show them the application that you filled out, you show them your birth certificate, they might want to check your ID, and you make this declaration. They will stamp it, they will sign it, just saying like that you're here, you're declaring that it's true. I have been told that it's best when you're swearing something to use your current legal name, not the one that you're changing it to, just because you're swearing you are who you say you are, and it's a very legal process. So you would sign with your current legal name. Okay. Now we have some information on the request for non-publication. So Ontario automatically publishes all legal name change in a newspaper called the Ontario Gazette. You can imagine that some people, especially in the trans community, do not want their name to appear here for privacy and safety reasons. So trans people can automatically qualify to exempt themselves from having their name published. But in order to exempt, you have to fill out this documentation. Otherwise, previous name and current name, legal names will be posted in a public way. There are a lot of people who change their name every day, but it could still be searched. It is a permanent legal record. So if you want, you can leave it if you need another record to prove that you've changed your name, but just know it can be searched. So some people don't feel very comfortable with that. Okay, so if you're just doing the legal name change, not doing a gender marker change, this is what we've just gone over. There's the application that includes the guarantor information that's signed by the commissioner. There's the fee, and you also have to include your original birth certificate. And then there's the request for non-publication. I put this image here because it can be a little confusing sometimes to send mail in this age. Some folks on this call might not send much mail. So essentially you put a return address in the top left corner, which is your address or where you will be in the next 6 weeks. In case they need to return something to you, that's where you put your information. in the center, you put where all the information is going. This is all going to the office of the Registrar General, which is in Thunder Bay. The address is on the application form. And then you also include a postage stamp. If it's very heavy, it might need more postage stamps. And another thing that you could do is send it by registered mail, which is something you would get at the post office where you would pay. And so it tracks where it is in case it were to get lost, since that is your original birth certificate that you're mailing. I think that could be helpful. Also to create a few copies of your original birth certificate, just in case anything is to be lost or destroyed. So if your name change is approved, you'll get a change of name certificate. It will show your previous name and your new name. You can either use the certificate to change your name on other personal documents, like your driver's license. And for everyone who is born in Ontario, they'll receive a new birth certificate with their new name. So you already paid $137, they will just send you a new birth certificate. That's unique for the name change, whereas with the gender marker change, you have to apply for a new birth certificate. So we will get there too. But these are all the documents. This is what we've just gone over. The timeline is about 4 to 6 weeks to have your name changed. Once you've got that name change certificate, you can update your provincial ID at Service Ontario, like your driver's license, your health card, or if you might have a photo ID card, if you don't have a driver's license. That shouldn't cost anything, should be free, unless it's your first time applying for a driver's license or a photo ID card. You will get a paper copy immediately, and then they will mail you the card copies about a month later in the mail. You'd also want to update your federal IDs, like your SIN number. You can do that at Service Canada Centre, and it should be free. And then you'll also want to update your passport. Passports are a little bit expensive. So for 5 years, a 5-year valid passport, it does cost $120. For a 10-year valid passport, it costs $160. You can do this at Service Canada. For a passport, you also do need a guarantor who has known you for 2 years and is not related. And then you have to get new passport photos, that kind of thing. So there are a few other places too. I mean, a lot to think about, right? Where your name might be listed, your school, your work, your bank, your accounts, like for the hydro, your landlord, your doctor's office, your dentist's office, your optometrist's office, your health benefits. If you have any legal documents where you're listed as like a power of attorney for someone, all these things should be changed to have your legal name updated. Oh, okay. I think I went through that pretty quickly. Is everybody still with me? Because I'm moving on to the next step, which is changing your gender marker. I'm not hearing anything, so I think that this is a good sign. Stan, feel free to, I don't think I see messages, so if there's anything, just interrupt me, like stop me, okay?
Sounds good. We're having some thumbs up in the chat, so I think you're good to move on.
Okay, great. Yeah, I don't see the chat at all, so hopefully everybody is putting smiley faces and thumbs up and or boo the government, but we can do this. Okay, so we're moving on to changing your gender marker. So similarly, this is going to be for folks who are born in Ontario, who are 18 or over, who have lived in Ontario for the last 2 years. So in this process, you can change your gender marker to an F, to an M, or to an X. You do not have to have had any specific medical treatments like surgery or hormone therapy to change your sex marker. This is all going to go also to the office of the Registrar General. So as I'm talking, some things are going to sound a little bit similar to the name change. If you're doing both, You put them all in the same package, it all goes together, and then you get one birth certificate with your new gender marker and your new name, instead of doing two in two different processes where you end up with two different birth certificates. So for changing your legal gender marker, the main task is to change it on your birth registration and birth certificate. Then, like we spoke about, you'll update your provincial IDs, you'll update your federal IDs. There's other places to update your gender marker too. Today, we'll talk mostly about step one, the most complicated part. So for legal gender marker change, there are a few more documents than just the application. So there is the application for change of sex designation, which requires a letter from a doctor or a psychologist. Then there's also the statutory declaration, which you sign in front of a commissioner of oaths. There's a request for a birth certificate where you will have a guarantor to prove your identity. There's also a fee for the birth certificate. It's $25, but there's no longer a fee for the other forms. If you have a form that has credit card information that it's requesting, it's because it's an outdated form because they've waived that fee. So the only fee for this part would be actually for the birth certificate. Okay. So this is the first document that I mentioned, the application for change of sex designation on a birth registration of an adult. This is telling me that we need a letter from a practicing physician, so a doctor, medical doctor, or a psychologist, including a psychological associate. So this is somebody who is practicing in Canada, and unfortunately, nurse practitioners are not eligible to write these letters. It has to be from a physician. The other thing that you will require is giving them your birth certificate, because they need all of your documents. So the letter from the physician, you do not, like I said, have to have undergone any specific trans-related medical treatment, like any surgeries or any hormones, in order to change your gender marker. So it doesn't have to be the doctor even who's treating you for your gender, like who is providing gender care, that's okay. It just has to be a doctor or a psychologist. So it has to be on the doctor's official letterhead, and state that they have examined you or treated you and that the change in sex designation is appropriate. And then it has to be signed by the doctor or the psychologist. So this is a template that you can give your doctor that has the information that's required. So it's not very long or complicated. They don't have to say if you're on any medical, like hormones or anything. It just says, I'm a doctor, this is my qualification, I confirm, sign it. I have heard that it's best to sign it in blue ink by the provider, because sometimes they reject if they think it's an electronic signature, or if they think it's a photocopy. They want an original document. So we'll provide you this template as well. The next form is the statutory declaration for change of sex designation. So this is where you will mark off that you're changing the sex designation from something to something else. You can, like I said, male, female, or X, which means that the applicant doesn't identify exclusively as male or female. And there's a little note here about the X gender that just says that the government cannot guarantee that this birth certificate will be accepted by organizations in Ontario or other jurisdictions. I'm not sure who those organizations are. I don't have much more information about that, but it seems like they're just making a disclaimer that some ID, that having an X, some places might not be caught up to recognize this as legitimate, which is unfortunate, of course, and hopefully we're getting there, but that's something to note. So this statutory declaration is signed by a commissioner. So again, the commissioner is the person who will ask you to swear or affirm that the document is true. And it could be a Service Ontario worker, could be a lawyer or a judge, or an MPP. And again, I suggest that you sign it with your legal name, just because it's there with this legal person. They'll have to look at your ID, they'll look at your birth certificate, they'll look at your application, and they will give the stamp, the sign to move on. So the request for birth certificate form. So far we went through a few of the documents. This is the hardiest one. This one asks a lot of personal information on a birth certificate. So it might be a trickier one to complete. They will ask things like the name of the attendant at birth, the parent's birth and marital information, and including like time of birth, age, when you were born. So it's a little bit of a complicated one. It would be helpful to have a parent support if possible. If not, I think it's still worthwhile to send it in with as much information as you have and see what they say. So this is the longest part of this application, is applying for the birth certificate, requesting a birth certificate. Like I said, the cost is $25. You can also request a certified copy of your birth registration. So that's different from a birth certificate, but it's not required very often unless you're doing immigration applications or for citizenship, visa applications, or adopting a child abroad. So generally just buying the birth certificate for $25 is acceptable. All right, so the guarantor for the birth certificate, this time, instead of 1 year, they want them to know you for 2 years. And they give a similar list on the left. These are the same list of the first time that we were talking about guarantor for a name change, but they also added extra people who could be a guarantor. So even though it's 2 years, so it's longer, they're saying that they would also accept engineer, teachers, other people who normally were not accepted as guarantors. So if you're getting the same guarantor for both documents, I recommend using the one that is for the name change, because they're a bit stricter, and someone who's known you for 2 years. So same, a medical practitioner, hopefully a family doctor would do this for you. So the family doctor could be the guarantor for name change, gender marker, and write your letter. That would be the best way to make that happen. Otherwise, pharmacist, chiropractor, they give a list, veterinarian, that one, medical practitioners, this is the list that they gave us. So we'll try and find somebody who's on the list to be a guarantor who has known you for 2 years. Again, this is not to prove or disprove your gender. This is to prevent government fraud, identity fraud. Make sure that you are who you say you are, that you've lived in Ontario for the last 2 years. This is the part that the guarantor will complete. They give like their contact information. So I guess the government could call them and say, is this person, have you known this person for how long? How do you know this person? Have they been in Ontario? This stuff. So we're rounding the corner here. As we just went over, these are the different forms and steps for only changing legal gender marker. So there was the application, there was the letter from the doctor or psychologist. You have to give the original birth certificate. You have to do the statutory declaration where the commissioner also is present. You have to do the request for the birth certificate where there is guarantor information. And you have to pay a fee of $25. This timeline takes about 6 to 8 weeks. It is also sent to the Office of the Registrar General in Thunder Bay. And it's mailed in the same way. Your return address where you are going to be in 6 to 8 weeks, you put it here. You have the postage stamp, you have the address for the Office of the Registrar, which is on the documentation they give you it. If you can, mail it through registered mail, because that's your original copy of your birth certificate, and the registered mail will track where it is. So once you have your gender marker change document on your new birth certificate, then you can update your provincial ID at Service Ontario. That's when you bring your new birth certificate to update your license and your health card and your photo ID card if you have one of those. Then you'd update your federal IDs like your passport. The other thing to note is about the X gender marker on a passport. Unfortunately, not all governments, like foreign governments, will recognize passports with an X. So that may restrict your ability to travel to some countries if you choose to have an X on your passport. Something else around X gender markers is that if you're not planning to go through this whole process, but you just want your gender marker changed on your license, you have a driver's license, you can bring that to a Service Ontario and say, I want my gender marker changed to an X. They don't have to have any of these documents from a doctor. The Service Ontario workers there can change it on your driver's license. So the other places you might want to update your gender marker once you have gone through this process is your school, your doctor's office, dentist office, Elections Canada, your health benefits, and any legal documentation that you are signed on. So if we are doing both together, a name change and gender marker change, this is the list of all the things that we've just went over. And we always need to send the original birth certificate. So the whole process could be up to 8 weeks to get information back. And if they find something they don't like about one of the applications, then they'll be contacting you to ask you to resubmit. So there's a lot, right? There's a lot of different documents. The good thing is there are supports to help you through this if you need it. The best thing to do, like I said, is really just go one at a time. You can do it online as well, like on Adobe, like you can fill it out on your keyboard if you want to practice instead of writing it, and then you can print it. But there are some supports. The Gender Affirming Assistance Project in Kingston is staffed of volunteer peer mentors, and they will help you with this whole process. They have a Google form online where you can select that you're looking for help with legal documentation. Otherwise, there are a number of legal ID clinics online. There's Trans Wellness Ontario, Halton ID Clinic, Kind Space, that one's in Ottawa, 519 Virtual Trans ID Clinic. For folks who have questions for lawyers, sometimes they're law students as well, especially if you have a bit of a more complicated application, that might be a helpful space to try. Here at Kingston Community Health Centre, the social workers here, like myself, can help you with this. We also have a practical assistance worker who can provide you a bit more support. And all this information I got today was from the 519 guides, which we will send to you as well. They have guides that are step-by-step what documents you need, what you have to fill out, with tips as well. So that information is really helpful. And just going slowly through everything, getting somebody to help to sit with you while you do it. It's a long process, but you can do it. We have got 2 questions now. So we'll open the floor. I know that was a lot of stuff to hear. Does anyone have questions about this process that I might be able to answer? Keeping in mind, we're trying not to give your legal name here because this is recorded, but I am here to see if I can help.
Hey, Carly. So there's one question in the chat. Are you aware of any supports available for people who need support with the cost?
I believe that if you are receiving Ontario Works, there's a case to be made with your OW worker. They have discretionary funds. And if you are to say that this having your legal documentation updated will help you to obtain employment, they might pay for some of these documents for you. That's one thing I've heard. I can't speak to GAP, but that might be a question for them as well, if they have any subsidy to help with these legal costs. Those are my two thoughts.
Okay, and I'll just clarify in the chat, GAP is Gender Affirming Assistance Program or project. The other question is, what happens if you don't have your original birth certificate? I only have a photocopy.
I believe you might have to apply to get an original birth certificate, which might be similar to that application that we were going through earlier. You might have to apply for a birth certificate first. Once you have it, then go through the next steps. Otherwise, I would check these 519 guides to see, they sometimes have other information, like for folks who are not born in Ontario, for example, what they would do in this situation. Yeah, but I think that might be your first hurdle, is getting a certified copy of your birth certificate that they will accept. But also you could try, like, it depends how you feel like going for it. You could try and submit the photocopy. You can, what I always suggest is write a letter that says, why don't you have your original birth certificate, and say, this is what I have. I'm submitting it now, like, and they might just say, no, you have to go through the next step. But basically they'll tell you what's wrong, and then hopefully they'll tell you how to correct it. So they might be able to answer that question a little bit better.
Okay, so 2 more questions. So the next question is, just for confirmation, you do or do not need to update your birth certificate in order to update your Ontario driver's license?
Yeah, kind of a tricky question. If you're going through the whole process, you want to update your other documents at the same time, then do that. If the only thing you want to update is your driver's license, there's a different process for, wait, are you talking about for name change or the gender marker change?
This person
Or
didn't
both.
specify. They're specifying now gender marker change.
Okay. For gender marker change, I believe that Service Ontario will also accept a letter from the doctor or psychologist. And I think you also write a letter. So that information is in the 519 guide. I don't know it specifically, but I believe there's some kind of loophole. If that's the only one you want to change, it's possible to change the gender marker just for the driver's license with a few other documents.
Okay, and then the other question was kind of a comment, more of a verification. I know that you kind of mentioned this, but I wanted to verify that social workers at the gender clinic would be able to help us go through this process.
Yeah, we can do our best. Like I could go through basically this presentation, and that's as much as my knowledge gets to. If there's something that's a little bit more legal or more complicated, then we would recommend that you actually ask a lawyer about it. But then we also have a practical assistance worker here. So if we need extra support of just like sessions to really work through it, the practical assistance worker can also help.
Okay, oh, sorry, go ahead, Carly.
I was just going to say, I think we should move on to the next section, if that's
great.
Okay.
Yeah, there's no other questions in the chat, but if people do have questions, it seems like we'll have a little bit of time at the end to answer those, but yeah.
Great. I am going to talk a little bit more before I send it over to Olivia. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about informed consent and gender dysphoria or incongruence. And then Olivia is going to give me a break and continue on to tell us all about puberty suppression, masculinizing hormone replacement therapy, feminizing hormone replacement therapy, transition-related surgeries in Ontario, and we will have time for questions. So KCHC Clinic uses an informed consent model, and this is recommended by worldwide and provincial guidelines for trans healthcare. Providers at our clinic will give you all the necessary information to make your own decision about your health and possible transition actions, like any medical possibilities. In the past, so I'm doing a big bracket, in the past, in order to access gender affirming care, there was like a rigorous system of evaluation that involved psychiatrists, where people had to prove that they're trans. This meant that people had to present in a certain way publicly or legally. This is the previous model that is outdated. This is not the model that is used today. So instead, our team works with individuals on a case-by-case basis to ensure that each person has the capacity to make an informed decision. So meaning that they understand the potential benefits, the risks, and the limitations of medical care. So in practice, this includes discussions of patients' expectations, the decision-making process, understanding the risks and benefits, support structures, general health, but it does not involve an evaluation of somebody's gender or whether they are truly trans. Okay. Also important to note that there's no age of consent or age of majority for medical decisions in Ontario. So understanding informed consent with adolescents really is on a case-by-case basis to make sure that they can understand benefits, risks, and limitations. So some diagnoses that you may hear come up in medical transitions are gender dysphoria or gender incongruence. So since we're working in a medical model that often requires labels in order to access care. So I'm just gonna, these are the general definitions of gender dysphoria and gender incongruence. So a variance basically between experienced gender and assigned gender, which can cause discomfort or can cause distress. And then the gender incongruence is a desire to transition in order to live and be accepted as a person of their experienced gender, which might include healthcare services to make somebody's body align with their experienced gender. So in our current clinical context, these diagnoses are used for the purpose of providing access to gender affirming care. So whereas previously, like I was mentioning, transgender identity was not seen very as a holistic part of somebody. It was sometimes seen as a mental disorder, as a pathology. That's not how these diagnoses are used today. And individuals have unique relationships to these diagnoses and these terms. So some people might find it affirming to speak about gender in these ways, but if you don't, that's okay too. And someone does not have to have significant distress in order to receive gender affirming care or to be trans. That's the end of my speech. Now I'm going to turn it over to Olivia. You can just let me know when you're ready for me to change the slide.
All right, I'm ready. Hopefully everyone can hear me and there's not too much background noise in the back. Okay, so puberty suppression is a medical treatment that we can provide to youth who are hoping essentially to pause the puberty. So you do have to start puberty before this can be initiated. But there is certain medications that can be utilized in order to, the idea is to pause puberty. It's not a long-term treatment. So ideally, after you've been on the medication for months to maybe a year, the max we tend to use it is 2 years. Then at that point, we would consider hormone replacement therapy. But sometimes why clinicians choose puberty suppression over just initiating hormones in younger youth is because it gives that extra time for them to decide if it's something that they want to continue to pursue. And it can also pause when puberty is just paused. It can help with dysphoria if a client is a person is very dysphoric. Going through puberty, it kind of gives a moment to pause and not to have to continue those changes. Okay, so next slide, Carly. Okay, so this is, as Carly mentioned earlier, like a very, very broad overview of hormones. So I'm not going to be going into detail. This is not as inclusive as if you were to see me at the gender clinic or see your primary care provider. It's meant to kind of be a very, very broad overview. But some of the benefits of masculinizing hormone therapy include, well, a deepened voice for sure is one of the biggest benefits. Body fat redistribution, increased muscle mass, cessation of menses. There's also other effects that occur. Some clients really embrace them, or people embrace them. Other people may view them as not as desired, but I think it's important to note you don't have to embrace every single change that occurs. So with masculinizing hormone therapy, sometimes there's some skin oiliness that can happen. There can be it's called bottom growth or clitoral enlargement that some clients really welcome, other people are not as fond of, as well as some vaginal dryness. It's important to note that some of these changes are permanent. So when, in this case, for masculinizing hormone therapy, we use testosterone. So when testosterone is initiated, the certain effects are permanent and don't reverse, even if the medication is stopped. And that's why we use this informed consent model. So Carly, if you want to switch the slide. So this is kind of a timeline of what to expect. And it basically, it's a little bit different for everybody, but the idea is that it's not overnight. The changes happen gradually from months to years. So some of the changes you can see, like body fat redistribution, happens more quickly. Again, the reversibility is based on the best evidence that we have at this time. So some of the evidence that we have, we're building, but from what we do know for sure, like the voice deepening is considered more permanent. And we also counsel that for sure, like infertility, it is variable, but we say that there's a chance that you could have infertility as well. And that's something we counsel more on if you come to the gender clinic about family planning, and there is options to see a fertility clinic before pursuing hormones. So I'll just mention, so for testosterone treatment, we typically have two forms that we use, and that's either the injection, so injectable testosterone, and that's either weekly or every other week, or the gel. Testosterone is typically covered through the injections for sure, and one type of the gel are covered through ODB. So that's either if you're under 25 or if you're on ODSP, or if obviously if you have private insurance, then it's covered as well. Okay, so Carly will just switch slides there. Yeah, so part of initiating masculine hormone therapy, so that's the informed consent models. So it's important that when you meet with your provider, they'll go through the benefits, the risks, the irreversible changes. I won't go into too much detail now, but there is also like clear benefits to masculinizing hormones. There's also some risks that we know compared to when we look at the research that has been done. Like I said, it's not rigorous clinical trials, but we do have more and more research coming through, and we have an idea of some of the risks that could happen and how we call it mitigating or decrease those risks. And ultimately, the best way to do that is to meet with clients and see what their medical history looks like, and if there are any risks, and how do we prevent risks essentially before we start treatment. So with that, when you meet at the gender clinic for the first time, if it was with me, for instance, that's what we go through. So we kind of talk about the gender journey, which Carly went through a little bit and the reason we do that is for that diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And then we go through your medical history and what that looks like. So that would be your past medical history, your surgeries, allergies, everything like that. And then we talk about if you're there for hormones, we talk about hormones in a little bit more detail than today. Okay, next slide, Carly. Yeah, so another really important piece, right, is binding safe. So a lot of transmasculine clients choose to bind, and that can be very gender affirming and very positive for a lot of clients. And there is more resources that I can always provide on that, but it's important to have some binder free time, like not binding when you're sleeping, that sort of thing. But if you are binding properly and safely, it can be very, very positive and a really a great way to feel more confident. And I think that's just another piece to say that there's many other parts of the transition than just the medical transition. And it's never a problem to come meet with a provider and discuss hormones. But as Carly mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there's many, many different avenues and journeys that everyone takes. And you do not ever have to pursue hormones. Even if you choose to come to one visit, that doesn't mean that you're committing to it or that you have to. Okay, next slide, Carly. Yeah, so feminizing hormones. So as I mentioned, with masculinizing hormones, we use testosterone. And in feminizing hormones, we have two hormones that we use. So one is called a testosterone blocker or an anti-androgen. And that, as the name sounds, it blocks testosterone. And the reason that we use those agents are basically so that when we introduce estrogen, which is the second hormone that we use, we don't need as high of a dose. If we didn't have the blocker, often you need too high of a dose of estrogen, and that can cause more side effects. So there's two hormones that are used. The blockers, the one that is normally initiated first. Different clinics have different ways of doing it, but at our clinic, typically we do the blocker first. There's two blockers to choose from, which I won't go into great detail today. There's spironolactone or there's cyproterone. Often the reason we choose one over the other is based on your medical history, also preference. So those are utilized first, and then the estrogen is initiated. And estrogen can be typically the most common route is orally, but there is also the form for the patch. The patch is a little bit more tricky to get coverage for, though. And again, like the pros and cons of that would be discussed for your individual case. So when you're on the anti-androgen and the estrogen, some of the effects that we see are on this slide here. So the softening of the skin, slowed growth of the body or facial hair, decreased muscle mass, breast growth, fat redistribution, and then a decrease in testicular volume, libido, spontaneous erections, a decrease in sperm production, and erectile dysfunction. So as I mentioned earlier, some of these changes you don't have to embrace every single one. And every client will kind of be different and in the changes that they're really excited about, or maybe some that they're not as excited about, and that's okay. Carly will go to the next slide. So again, this is for feminizing therapy, what effects are reversible and which ones are not. And again, the timeline of the changes. So some of those changes are going to happen more quickly at like 1 month, and then some of them will be more like to get the complete results will actually take years. So it is a process. Some of the changes that are irreversible are the breast growth. We always counsel that fertility is irreversible, but that can be variable, but that is the counseling that we do. Yeah, and so this is a nice slide too. And these slides are from Rainbow Health. So if you do want the full documents or reading more on that, that's where I'm getting them from. Okay, next slide. So again, with feminizing hormones, there's lots of benefits, which we talked about. There is, again, like some risks that you can go over with your provider specifically. And those risks can be mitigated. I will make a note just in general for risks. The healthiest version of you is going to be essentially the decrease. You'll be decreasing risks. So part of that would look like not smoking, being a healthy weight, having a healthy diet, exercise. All of those things actually really, really help to decrease risks in general of any, I don't think hormones, just in any medical treatment, right? But also hormones. So if you're waiting to see someone at the gender clinic, those are things that can certainly take time to work on, right? It's not always easy to achieve those things overnight. That will ultimately like help decrease risks of hormones. And then, yeah, there's irreversible changes with feminizing hormones as well. And that's why we use that informed consent model. And with hormones, what that looks like is essentially that even if there are some risks, that you can say, these are the risks and I'm okay to take these risks, right? So, yeah. Okay, next slide, Carly. So transition-related surgeries in Ontario. So this is another piece that, like Carly was talking earlier about, how there's lots of steps we have to take with the government, and this is no different with surgeries. So it's different than other referrals that we do as providers. There's more steps. So ultimately, when you're applying for a transition-related surgery in Ontario, it is helpful to have a provider that has done some courses on transition-related surgeries, because it will make the process a little bit smoother. And when they have to write, if you can see in the fourth step of the ladder, this referral to the surgeon, it does have to be done. You have to prove your credentials in that. So if you were looking, or you came to see me for a transition-related surgery in the gender clinic, what that would look like is we start with a surgical planning visit. So we talk about a gender history again, and that the reason for that is for the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which is a criteria for surgery. And then we talk about your medical history, again, which includes like what medications you're on, your mental health, your past surgeries, allergies, and then about the surgery itself, why you want to have it, what procedures there are like for that specific surgery, because there's sometimes different types, like ways of going about the surgery, and one place will do it differently than another. So where you want to have it, the costs associated with it, the pre-op care requirements, and what the aftercare planning would look like. So we don't do all of that in one visit, but we kind of do it over the course of a few visits, and those are called the surgical planning visits. And And when we've been through some of that and we know where we want to apply, and that kind of meet the requirements for surgery, then we do the prior approval form. So that form goes to the government. It's basically just one form saying, like, it's a checkbox, like you've met the requirements, check, send. If it's a bottom surgery, it requires two people to sign that form. So you'd have to do your surgical planning visit with a first assessor and a second assessor. If it's a top surgery, it's just one assessor. So that can take some months to get that form back, or the approval. When we finally get the approval back, so that's the approval letter received, then the first assessor and the second assessor, if you're doing bottom surgery, would do a letter to this, or a referral letter to the surgeon. And like I was saying, that letter is pretty specific, and it's saying that you meet the requirements of surgery and you're medically well enough for the surgery, and that we've obtained informed consent for the surgery, so that you understand the benefits, risks, the procedure, and the aftercare, and you're a good surgical candidate. So they're pretty strict in Ontario about who writes those letters. So family physicians, absolutely, they can write them. Nurse practitioners, if there's training through Rainbow Health, so if they've done that training, they're more than qualified and can definitely do that. So when that referral letter is sent, then the surgeon will call you for a consult and discuss the surgery, and then you'll be booked in for surgery. So I will say it seems like a very daunting process, and there is a lot of work that goes into it, but we can help to try to make that smoother. And like, for instance, for chest surgery, they did a mastectomy. They did a recent review at Women's College of how long it took from starting the surgery planning visits to the actual surgery. Again, I don't know if this was pre or post COVID, so it might be not, depending on when it was done, a little bit different now, but they said it was about a year. So even though that's still a long time, and there is a lot of steps, try to stay hopeful that it's definitely possible, and a lot of clients go through surgery and it does happen. Yeah, so that's the process, and we'll go to the next slide, Carly. So this is some more specific surgeries that are covered in Ontario. So these are funded surgeries, and these are some of the requirements that need to be met for the surgery. So this is when I was talking about, well, I guess both the funding letter and the referral to the surgeon. These need to be met. One thing I will note, so for a chest mastectomy, you do not need to be on hormones. Some of these criteria will most likely be updated very shortly. The funding model is still based on the WPATH 7th edition, and the 8th edition just came out proposing some changes. One of those changes is hormones for 6 months instead of 12 months, but currently we still have to use this funding criteria. So I'll go through kind of a little bit. So the gender dysphoria, Carly spoke about that diagnosis. The hormones for 12 months. So that's actually from when you initiate hormones, a 12-month period right now. Living as this 12-month GRE is basically living as the gender that you'd like to be assigned to, and that has a little bit of leeway. So for instance, if you had socially transitioned in one aspect of your life, then we can kind of use that. So that criteria will certainly probably be updated in the future. For medication and mental health conditions reasonably well controlled for chest surgery and breast augmentation are requirements. And then for lower surgery, they need those conditions very well controlled. And then a capacity to make informed decision and informed consent. So that's part of the informed consent model. And that's why when you go through the surgical planning visits, your provider will talk to you about like the procedure, what it is, the risks, the benefits, the alternatives, the aftercare plan. And that's part of making an informed decision for that surgery. Another thing to note for the surgical piece and things that you could do while you're waiting to prepare for surgery, again, being the healthiest version of yourself. So a lot of the surgeries require stopping smoking before the referral will be accepted. So they're pretty strict on that. And we have supports at the Kingston CHC to help with that. But smoking or vaping, they are very strict for. Another one is the BMI cutoff. So again, and that I won't get into too much in this presentation tonight, but each center kind of has a different BMI. And the reason for these things, I will say, is so that is because with the risk of anesthetic, they want to make sure that the surgeries are safe for everyone. That is the idea behind it. So I don't make those rules, obviously, but each surgeon has their own cutoff. So those can act as barriers. But we do try to work around those, but certainly it's something to consider. Okay, next slide, Curly. Yeah, so that's kind of, and like I said, this was a very kind of quick version of the medical and surgical overview. If you were to meet, let's say, with me at the gender clinic, it's definitely more tailored to your specific needs and medical history. But this is kind of a broad overview and hopefully provided a few fun facts. So if there's any questions, I can take those now.
Thanks, Olivia. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat right now. But I take it that this is the end of the presentation entirely. Oh, just kidding. We have one question. All right. So this question is, do you have any information on chest surgery that isn't a full mastectomy, but is a reduction, specifically for those who are non-binary or gender fluid?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So in order for one, and this is something I guess I should clarify too, there has to be a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So if there wasn't, so if it was just a client who, in this case, if you were non-binary, you fit that criteria, right? But if it was someone who did not identify as non-binary and wanted a reduction, then you would have to go through a different pathway. If it was because like non-binary looking for a reduction, I think that could be discussed with the surgeon. It would be a little bit of a different technique than the typical mastectomy. One of the things to note, so with the mastectomies, there's different ways that they do it. And one of the most common ways in Ontario is called a double mastectomy, where they actually, part of that process is they recontour the nipples. So they take them off, they reshape them, and they regraft them on. So in that sense, like if you had still wanted to leave some tissue, I'm sure they could do that, or that's a request that could be made to the surgeon, but they probably would still do the grafting. So there is different ways to have the procedure done. So some clients will choose not to have nipples when they do the mastectomy, and that's absolutely happens, and it is a great choice. So I think that you can tailor your likes and your wants to the surgery, as long as the surgeon's able to perform the technique using that technique, then it would be more than reasonable. Yeah. And So for instance, with the with the mastectomies, like some clients, the other way to do the procedure is called the keyhole. So they don't actually do a double mastectomy. It's a little bit of a different procedure, but one of the reasons they might not be able to do that is if your anatomy, like if you had larger chest, then they wouldn't be able to do it. So there is some restrictions that way, but I always think if you're wanting something in the surgery, it's definitely best to ask, because they can tailor the surgery to you, and you want it to be something that you're going to be happy with. So I think in the short, it would be a more than reasonable request to discuss with your healthcare provider.
I can add like something that I've heard too is if somebody happens to have pain related to chest, like back pain, sometimes family doctors will request a reduction, not necessarily related to gender dysphoria. So what we're discussing is like specifically gender affirming surgeries, but
Absolutely.
sometimes like that can be a possibility to maybe not have to wait for all the funding steps. There's still going to be different wait times, but if you do have pain or other reasons to have a breast reduction, a chest reduction, then that could be a possibility to talk about. Would be similar for a hysterectomy if you have pain. I mean, maybe I will not speak about this specifically as not the medical provider, but if there are other reasons to have surgeries that are not necessarily related to your gender, you could discuss that with your medical provider as well, if it would also end up benefiting your gender journey. Is that fair to say, Olivia?
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah. It's a different pathway, but it can be, but yeah, absolutely. I think you're more than right, Carly. For the hysterectomy one, it would have to be, it would, you would definitely want to discuss it with your provider. It kind of is an individual basis, right? Yeah.
I was just gonna say that I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. But I take it that this is like the end of the presentation, so if people just had questions in general, like now having listened through everything about legal or medical transition, they could kind of start asking that. But I just wanted to say thanks, because I felt like this was really helpful for me to learn some new information. And you both are very like well-informed and very warm and inviting people. So I'm sure people are gonna be very lucky to like chat with you and get support through y'all. But yeah, I guess if people don't have any more questions, we'll be sticking around. At least I'll be sticking around a little bit. We have until 7. But I don't know if it made sense to pause or end the recording at this point. Yes, nodding head.
I'll just say like kind of in general as a wrap up too, like all folks are welcome at the clinic if you're at the beginning stages of your transition and you're still exploring what your identity is, what the next steps are for you medically or legally, and you have questions. We're here to help support you with this. Or if you're at a stage where you're like, I know exactly what I want and I've spent a lot of time discussing this, and it doesn't matter if you're like a much older person. We do start working with folks around 12 and up. But we'll be happy to support you with your like unique goals, including them medically, like to talk about kind of what makes the most sense for you. And we'll be a space that, you know, you can show up and ask questions and explore and be curious, and you don't have to have all the answers either.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I'm okay to end it now. Anything else you want to add, Olivia, before officially our recording is done?
No, I think it's really great that so many people came out today, and yeah, we're more than happy to answer questions, or if you have any questions about like medically or surgery, don't feel like it means you have to be 100% committed. You can come meet with me, ask those questions, and I'm just as happy to do that and give more information. Yeah.
Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, with that, I will stop the recording.